And whenever. Well, welcome, Stanley. We're here with an eclectic global crowd on Humanity Rising, and we're so glad and honored that you were able to make some time for us to record this presentation for the group that's now assembled live to hear about, Stanley Krippner, the legendary parapsychology pioneer. And I was saying to Peter the other day, Stan, your first, what we're calling anomalous experience was in 1946. That's a year before I was born. I had no idea it went back that far. But Stanley, why don't you start off with, some of those stories in the sense of, what has happened in your life, how it then moved you into, in a sense, a lifetime of studying consciousness in a wide variety of ways, and very particularly the kind of parapsychological experiences, events, anomalous things that have happened, and to some degree, what it means for all of us, for yourself, for us, and we'll ask you a few questions along the way. Is that okay, Stan?
That's just fine. Tall order. Let's see what happens. Right. I hope I do you justice.
Okay.
Actually, to answer your question succinctly, yes, in 1946, I was very disappointed because my parents did not have enough money to buy me a set of World Book Encyclopedia that my aunt was selling. $100 for the complete set, which in those days was a lot of money, and my parents, being farmers, simply didn't have it. And I went up to my room and I was so sad, and I was thinking, well, who can I borrow the money from? I have one rich relative, or at least fairly rich relative. That's my Uncle Max, who works for a dairy corporation near Madison, Wisconsin. And then I thought, no, I cannot ask Uncle Max because he's dead. I don't know how that thought popped into my mind, but it did. But remember, I was in a state of high emotion at the time. And we know that high emotion often characterizes these spontaneous psychic experiences. So anyway, I heard a scream and I ran downstairs to see if my mother had fallen or something. And she said, your Uncle Max has just died. So that, of course, came as a surprise. And I only told a few people about it out of fear that they would think that either I was lying or this was some sort of a bizarre satanic diabolical power that I had. And yet I began to read about the topic. And at that time, there was a radio show with the famous mentalist, Joseph Dunninger, and I listened to it avidly. It was years later that I discovered that Dunninger was a very clever magician and mentalist, and that what he was doing on the show was a very, very sophisticated sleight of hand. He also did this on television years later. And then years after that, much to my surprise and other synchronicity, I actually met him at a magician's show that a psychiatrist friend of mine had taken me to, and my psychiatrist friend knew Dunninger. So I finally had a chance to tell him that he and his show had triggered my interest in parapsychology after all those years. So I went to the University of Wisconsin and I became a member of the Union Forum Committee, which brings speakers. And I said, well, why don't we bring a mentalist like Joseph Dunninger or Franz Polgar? I named a couple of people. And then my supervisor said, don't you realize that these are all magicians? This is all show business? And I took her word for it. And of course, she was right. And then another nice coincidence, I was taking a philosophy course by Campbell Garnett, a famed philosopher in those days. And he told the class about how these psychic experiences being explored scientifically in North Carolina by Joseph Banks Rhine and his wife, Louisa E. Rhine, at their parapsychology laboratory. Well, then I did some research to find out what they were doing, and I got our committee to invite J.B. Rhine to speak, and we couldn't get much money because all of the departments that could have given us money said we don't want anything to do with that pseudoscience. And so Ryan said, if you can pay my expenses, I'll take a train from Madison to Wisconsin after I finish addressing the American Chemical Society in Chicago. So that's how we got J.B. Rhine to come to the campus. And again, much to faculty disparagement, at least in psychology, one faculty member said, if you're interested in parapsychology and any of that other BS, you can hear it from the horse's mouth by going to hear J.B. Rhine tomorrow night. And then another professor said, if you invite Rhine to speak, you should also invite Father Divine to speak on recent advances in the art of healing. Father Divine was a famous faith healer in those days. Now, interestingly enough, I actually spent some time with both of those professors of psychology years later, and we had very amiable discussions. Of course, I didn't mention what I had known from years before, but I did record it, and I wrote it down in several places, so it's a matter of record. So that's a short version of the story. Now, let me go one step further. I found out that other friends of mine had had those experiences, and they also said, well, we don't dare tell anybody about it because they'll think that we're making it up, or they'll think that I'm psychotic and hallucinating. And so one of my motives in studying parapsychology was to show that this isn't really paranormal at all. It's normal in the expanded sense of the word. And of course, there's no good evidence that most people who have these psychic experiences have any type of psychopathological predisposition for it. So there you have it.
Jim, you're muted.
Stan, two things stand out, and one I'd like you to elaborate a little more on. But first, it's interesting that, as you put it, over time, people whom you knew at one point and then met again years later have a different perspective on the same topic, in a sense. And, you know, it's been my experience that throughout life, we begin to integrate more of some of what might have been the edge into mainstream. I mean, and we look at other aspects of science, and we know that's true, quantum physics and neuroscience. You know, when I took my first brain physiology course, probably a senior in high school, I was told that by the time you're 23, the brain is set for the rest of your life. Right. And now we know you can change it until you die. And so it's just interesting that over time, if we give ourselves the opportunity to both learn and reflect, then going back to part of the purpose of this discussion, parapsychology and its effects, in a sense, can bring more meaning into our lives today than it might have 30 years ago. And so I just wonder if you'd comment on that for a minute.
Yes, of course, that's very well put. I'll give you another example. When I was at the University of Wisconsin taking psychology courses, dreams were mentioned by only one professor. And he said, anybody who dreams in color is psychotic. This is a red flag that the person might be schizophrenic or have some other psychosis. He didn't even say neurotic, psychotic. Well, that's a big, heavy word. To be honest, and my friends and I were all looking at, oh, we all dream in color. Does that mean they're schizophrenic? Obviously, we didn't believe him. And again, I ran into that same professor years later when we were both teaching at Kent State University. No, I did not mention the earlier comment he made.
Yeah.
And hopefully he had done some reading since that time. I don't know. So yes, things change over time. And again, once it was admitted that dreaming in color is not a sure sign of schizophrenia, then another problem came up where some leading neuroscientists are saying, well, dreaming is nonsense. It's just a random collection of images with no meaning. But now we've got ample experimental evidence to debunk that. When people have some sort of a conflict, they tend to dream about that conflict or possible solutions to that conflict. When people have a big event coming up, they're likely to dream about preparations for that event because dreams help us prepare for the future. And also, the main function of dreams is to consolidate memories and regulate emotions. And that, of course, is tied to daily events. So those are just a couple of experiences I've run into where what was dogma at one point was shattered and replaced at another point.
And so you mentioned two things that I would like you to comment on. One, when you're talking about dreams, you're obviously talking about what we now call an altered state of consciousness. And when I was working with you at the Menninger Dream Laboratory in Brooklyn, back in the 69, 70, we looked at several different ways of affecting telepathic communication in altered states of consciousness. And one of those, as you remember, was we did a series of experiences at the Grateful Dead concerts. And it's hard to find a crowd of 20,000 people who are in such an altered state as all the kids at a Grateful Dead concert. So I just wonder if you might talk a little bit more, because it plugs into your point about high emotion and Uncle Max, and what are the elements here that might, facilitate this in every one of us to some degree, and the altered states that you've explored with, under scientific conditions that have really shown how some of this supposed psychic phenomena actually can exist.
Oh, that's a very good comment. For the listeners who don't know about the Grateful Dead concert, maybe they don't even know the Grateful Dead. It's a popular rock group. But the leader of the group, Jerry Garcia, came to me and said, we're going to be doing 6 nights at Port Chester, New York, and maybe we could do a long distance telepathy experiment. I said, well, that's a great idea. And so I made all of the necessary arrangements in terms of random selection of the painting that would be shown on the screen once the Grateful Dead were about an hour into their gig. And by that time, the members of the audience were in profound altered states, not only from their emotion, but from LSD, from marijuana, who knows what else. And so when they saw a sign flashing on the screen, you're about to participate in a telepathy experiment, well, why not? In their altered state, anything was possible. So they were focusing on trying to send a photograph to the English psychic Malcolm Besant, who was at Maimonides in the Dream Laboratory. And again, the pictures that we chose for the experiment, we tried to take high emotional pictures. So even if the person was not emotional, him or herself, they would still make a connection to something emotional. Well, the whole point is that Malcolm Besant did very well. And of course, you squared Malcolm Besant around New York City so he didn't run wild or get lost. And you got him to the, as they say, you got him to the church in time, and he performed extremely well. Now, that was a 6-night study. Our usual little studies are 8, 9, or 10, 11, or 12 nights. So this is sort of a pilot study. And yet we got substantial results. And now that little study is getting more publicity than any of our other more rigidly controlled studies, including a 50-year gig at the Portchester Theater, where some of the original ticket holders came to listen to a different rock musician, Billy Strings. And of course, they didn't have a telepathy experiment, but it was nice that we did the observance. So this is sort of an example of how one of the things we did got into one aspect of the mainstream, at least the cultural mainstream.
Can I ask something on building on that, Stanley? While we were at the Science and Consciousness last year, we did a small remote perception experiment that wasn't, under scientific conditions or anything, but we had half the group were in the woods and they just done a forest bathing experience. So it's a kind of heighten their senses, as it were. And they had to pick one out of 20 pictures. And at some point they picked a picture, and their task was to try to send it back to the other half of the group who were in the conference room. The other half of the group, were trying to pick it up, and they, as they described it and wrote things down. And when we came back and compared notes earlier, it was pretty clear that there was some fairly accurate hits on what they'd sent. But the interesting thing was that we asked them to try, the people in the conference room, to try to pick up the image 30 minutes before the group had even chosen the picture. Because this was what, during Brenda's work, they'd actually found it to be more effective when they did it outside of linear time, as it were. I just wondered if any kind of, and obviously there wasn't a high emotional state that the senders were in, but we had helped to kind of connect them to nature, as it were, which I guess put them in a different state of some kind.
Oh, well, that was a very noble attempt. I'm glad to hear the results. And of course, we did 2 precognitive dream studies with Malcolm Besant in our laboratory at Maimonides Medical Center, both of which got extremely high results, better results than what had been done in the ordinary waking state in regular time. So what you mentioned is certainly borne out by my experience also, yes. And again, putting this into the context of people's lives, some people, when they have a dream that comes true, especially a sad dream that comes true, they, oh my God, I caused that. I must have caused my cousin's death, or I must have caused that bridge to collapse. Of course, that's nonsense. You cannot logically make that connection. But again, when people have a bizarre experience, they sometimes jump to very illogical conclusions. So again, the more of this type of information is disseminated, people will not think that they're bizarre or crazy. They will not think that they're causing a problem. They'll simply accept this as one of many, many human experiences. And in the last analysis, a spontaneous case like this doesn't always bear up. The dream about the future doesn't always come true. The telepathy attempt doesn't always represent what another person is doing. So this is not a 100% guaranteed method of communicating or finding things out. I think that there's no harm in people getting together and trying to send healing to a person who's ailing, even if the attempt is not scientific, and even if the attempt has undetermined origins, sometimes that person actually feels better. Maybe it's just the thought that so many people are caring for that person. So I don't discourage this from happening at all. Sometimes it's not so important that we know all of the causes of an effect, but we appreciate the effect itself.
Yeah.
Well, and Stanley, I appreciate how you differentiate between our capacity to perceive versus our belief that, oh God, I did that. Because our perceptual possibilities are so much greater than what we normally imagine within ourselves. And I just wanted your brief comment on, when we talk with others. I mean, my view is that most of us have these deeper and broader perceptual capabilities that, for a wide variety of reasons, the culture, our upbringing, belief systems, et cetera, don't actually manifest. And do you think it actually is only certain very skilled people that can do this? Or is there an element within each one of us that actually can, be a part of a larger, in a sense, playing field that, where we can dream about something in advance?
Well, I think like so many other human traits, there's what we call a normal distribution of psychic capacities. A few people having virtually no psychic experiences, a few people having a lot of psychic experiences, and the rest of us falling sort of in the middle. And in our work at Maimonides, as you remember, sometimes we work with people who actually were established psychic senses, like Malcolm Besant. Other times, no, it was people who were very much interested in the topic, who were open-minded to the possibilities, and their enthusiasm was enough to sort of carry things through. So, yeah, so we worked with a group of people. And again, the folks who are listening to to our dialogue, it's very important to realize that there is a wide range of human potentials. And sometimes the human potentials are never realized because we're not living in the part of the world where they're necessary, such as tracking game or sensing when rain is coming, or some of the abilities that people in indigenous societies have perfected. Well, we have those same capacities, so they're all part of the human condition, all Homo species, Homo sapiens species, but we're not called upon to maximize those very rudimentary capacities. Just as people who in indigenous societies are not called upon to solve high-level mathematical problems because that's not necessary for them to survive in their environment. We have to remember that for traits to be passed on, they have to have survival value. In evolution, something does not get passed on if it doesn't have survival value. There might be a few idiosyncratic people who have those abilities, but they'll die out over time if they're not passed on.
Can I just build on that, Stanley, and ask, one of the reasons I started to get involved with this, I'd been doing a lot of work with kind of highly complex systems, lots of multi-stakeholder organizations, blah, blah, blah. And at some point I felt to me that the complexity was reaching the limits of our rational mind, that we simply couldn't grasp all of the complexity rationally, which is what pushed me into, well, there must be some, they talk about some simplicity the other side of that complexity. And it made me realize that there was, maybe other intelligences we needed to work with to be able to get more of a feeling for the whole, as it were, rather than an attempt to analyze it and put all the pieces together. And because it feels to me that that is right now a survival need for us collectively to be able to kind of sense from the whole, as it were, if we're really going to be able to co-create or emerge the solutions that are needed to many of our problems today. Do you recognize that? Would you say that maybe one of the reasons that there is more interest in this now is because people are recognizing that remembering our interconnectedness and being able to, I guess, communicate with more of reality than we might normally do with our rational mind is actually becoming a survival imperative?
Oh, I think this is a good point. For example, people in the Western world until recently had no notion of ecology. They were out to master nature, to exploit nature. Now we realize that this is destructive. Those people had the genes, the genetic material that indigenous people had. Indigenous people who lived in nature, of course, had to take care of the environment. Not all of them did, so I don't want to romanticize indigenous people, but for the most part, they knew how to take care of the environment. So-called civilized people in the Western world lost that trait, but it was still there. And now I think it's coming back. I think that I want to embroider on what Jim said a moment ago. When he was studying neurosciences, and I remember this too, we were told you have a number of neurons in the brain. They're there. You cannot change them. You can only hope that they don't die out. Now we know that the brain is flexible enough to create new connections, even new neurons all the time. Another thing that was hotly denied years ago, children of the Holocaust survivors often had symptoms of trauma that their parents had. And then the conventional answer, well, of course, the parents talked about the Holocaust and the children internalized this. No, this happened even when the children were adopted out or when their parents died early. And now we're finding out that sometimes the grandchildren are having the same traits. This is now called epigenetics. And people would have denied the possibility of epigenetics only a few decades ago. So you can see how our conception of the neurosciences keeps changing, even in the mainstream. And of course, someday the mainstream will be incorporating psychic abilities simply because they have to, because this will help explain other elements of neurology.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, a related, if I could, Peter, quickly, a related example, Stanley, is a group that you're semi-affiliated with called Dancing with the Trickster. And as I understand it, this is an attempt to gather what is being called anomalous psychic experiences among people everywhere. Can you say something about this?
Well, yes, if people want to look Dancing with the Trickster up on the website, this is in the internet, this is a website where people with unusual experiences can contribute their experiences to the website, either under their real name or under an assumed name. And the people who are pulling this together have two goals in mind. First of all, is to show people that they are not alone. They're not the only ones who are having weird experiences. And secondly, this is to collect a database that then can be used to compare it with earlier databases. And so, and also, once we get enough people coming in, to see if there are gender differences, age differences, ethnic differences, socioeconomic differences, and all the other markers that one might want to make a comparison for. Yeah, so it's on the internet, Dancing with the Trickster, and we encourage you to send in your own experiences and add them to the composite.
That's great. That's great, Stanley. And we'll make sure we put the website into the chat during the Humanity Rising session. If I go more, can I do one last question, Jim, and then we'll kind of wrap up?
Yeah, let me just make one comment following up on what Stanley said and what you said. You see, to me, this database that is increasing with participants, ordinary people who have anomalous, somewhat psychic experiences is an example, Peter, of what you were saying. The larger frame is expressing itself in a more tangible way, let's say, than it has in the past. And that may be driven by our absolute need, because it contributes to a different way of seeing the planet and our relationship with Mother Nature, and who we have to become to create a resilient and regenerative civilization for us. So I appreciate that both of you were pointing this out, and that it is relevant to our present lives, all of us who are on this call.
Yeah.
Back to you, Peter.
Yes, absolutely. And the sooner people realize that we're all connected at deep psychic and psychological levels, who knows, this might even get them to think twice before they engage in acts of random terrorism, is bedeviling the United States now, or even warfare, as you see with the Russians and Ukrainians killing each other, even though they're connected at a very, very deep level. From our point of view, this makes no sense. And eventually, we hope that humanity will wake up to this issue before it's too late.
Yeah, at the end of last year's conference, Science and Consciousness Conference, Stanley, which we called the Weird World of Mind and Matter, we concluded that what we needed to start to do is just is stop trying to prove this to ourselves anymore, and just assume that it is the case,
right?
That things are interconnected in this way, and this dimension of reality exists in us and around us. And so the theme of this year's conference is making weird the norm, right? So what does it mean if we assume that weird, W-Y-R-D, this web of interconnectedness, is actually the norm? So that's how I think we then start to, like you say, shift our reality in terms of the way we choose to show up and behave, and the actions we take, because of the way we're experiencing and understanding the world around us. So I wanted to ask you as a last question, after these many years of incredible work that you've been doing, it's not a small question, but how would you now describe, like if you had your grandchild on your knee or something, how would you now describe the nature of reality based on everything you've learned over the last years?
I don't think my pay grade is quite up to giving a good answer to the question. But because we don't have much time left, that gets me off the hook. I think the most important aspect of the nature of reality that I can offer is that consciousness is fundamental. That consciousness, however you want to describe the term, was there originally. The Big Bang came out of consciousness. No, consciousness was not one of the things that eventually came out of the Big Bang. Consciousness was there indefinitely and will still be there even when human beings in their present form no longer wander the face of the earth. The consciousness, the underlying fabric of reality, will maintain itself, and what we're dealing with now are little blips in that ocean of reality, little waves that pop up and then go back to the totality. But I think that's the best answer I can give to your question.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, Stanley.
Yeah, thank you, Stan, and have a